Picture this. The Vestal Virgins were the most powerful and respected women in Rome, living lives of immense luxury. But this privilege came with a terrifying price tag. The revered Vestal Virgins were not just priestesses, but political prisoners who, if they broke their 30-year vow of chastity, faced one of history's most horrifying punishments, being buried alive. If you want more bone-deep truths about the rituals that shaped Rome, subscribe to Engaging History and stay with me through this one. Power and piety often walk hand in hand with control, and the story of the Vestals shows how a sacred image can become a legal shackle that binds real people. She is not yet a woman when Rome takes her. She is a child folded into a tunic and led into a temple that will become both palace and prison. She is a child of 6 to 10, plucked from a household by augurs and magistrates because her family offered loyalty, status, or suitability. Imagine the ceremony: a small procession, the girl's hair cut in a ritual style, a new dress of white-wooled fabric, and a priestess placing a modest laurel or diadem on her head. The air tastes of incense and olive oil. Voices murmur Latin prayers to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. To the city, this selection is a triumph, another guardian of the sacred fire, another living symbol of Rome's eternal flame. To the girl and her family, it is the beginning of confinement disguised as honor. Training begins with ritual drills and the slow learning of formulas that must be recited without error. The Vestal must tend the sacred flame around which the community measures safety and fortune. Their quarters within the Atrium Vestae are palatial, private rooms, privileges most Roman matrons could only dream of, and a daily rhythm of visits from senators, gifts from wealthy patrons, and public reverence. You can hear the clink of bronze vessels, the soft rustle of togas as men bow and speak their petitions. You smell spiced wine and the iron tang of burning tallow. The sensory world of the Vestal is at once sumptuous and surveilled. Their legal status is paradoxical. The law elevates them: special seats at public games, exemption from paterfamilias control, and a voice that could sway political rituals. Yet that elevation is also their restraint. They belong to the state. Roman writers made clear that Vestals were public property, living embodiments of Rome's safety. The Latin term often used for the crime they were charged with is incestum, sacral impurity, an offense not merely religious, but political, for the purity of the Vestals was linked to the fortunes of the whole republic. The stakes are civic, the punishment is theatrical. Privilege sharpens into pressure. Imagine waking each day knowing that every eye could be watching for a sign, every whisper could be a rumor, every gesture could be turned into accusation. The Vestals move through ceremonies with scripted steps. Any deviation can be magnified. Their food and clothing are scrutinized, their letters inspected, and their comings and goings noted by officials whose loyalty is to Rome, stability, rather than to any individual woman. The luxury around them becomes a gilded cage, beautiful but surveilled. Rumors are a social currency in Rome. One slip of a look, one misread gesture at a festival, these can be embroidered into a charge. Accusations against Vestals could come from political rivals seeking leverage in the forum, or from private enmities that escalate into public scandal. The Roman historian who writes of such trials will often emphasize ceremony and moral panic, folding individual tragedy into civic narrative. Trials are public theater. Priests, pontiffs, magistrates, and citizens gather. Oaths are sworn. The city watches its mirror of sacred chastity. The mechanics of accusation are themselves loaded with ritual. When suspicion falls, the Vestal may be questioned by the Pontifex Maximus or other senior priests. Investigations involve witness statements, religious specialists, and sometimes bizarre tests. The city wants certainty. It needs a clear signal that the goddess has not been offended. and if the verdict lands on guilt, the ritual apparatus tightens. The punishment is not simply execution, it is an enactment, an attempt to solve a religious problem by returning the offender to the underworld, out of sight and out of presence, while preserving the outward sanctity of the temple. Consider the language Romans used to describe the condemned, words that neutralize and distance, a custody, a sealing, an interment that sounds liturgical even in its terror. The condemned Vestal is led through streets where the clatter of daily commerce continues, yet every face freezes as if in stage light. The sensory contrast is cruel, the warmth of public adoration turned to a cold, clinical procession. Citizens might throw down wreaths, avert their eyes, or whisper prayers. Dogs bark. The smell of the city, sweat, fish, and smoke, mixes with the odor of the solemn torchlit march. The state works to make the punishment both effective and discreet. The condemned woman is placed into a small, subterranean chamber provided with minimal provisions, a crust of bread, a flask of water, or a lamp, enough to make the death inevitable but framed as pious necessity rather than murder. The Romans call this chamber a confined space. Later, antiquity will remember it in phrases that suggest a box or chest. The ritual concludes with a sealing. Earth covers the entrance, and the city performs a legal fiction. Since the Vestal was buried, the state did not spill her blood, and the god's laws are respected. The private horror is thus codified into public sanctity. But before that sealing, there is a parade of symbolism. The condemned is not simply taken away. She is displayed in a formal ritual that reaffirms the social order. Visualize the sequence. Banners lowered, priests in black or subdued garb leading the way, the condemned wrapped in a simple mantle. The crowd watches her body move, as if it were a talisman whose misfortune must be removed. This public stripping of agency is designed to transform a human being into an object of civic purification, no longer an individual, but a symbol that Rome must excise. Behind the public pageantry, the emotional life is devastating and private. Imagine the inner sensory world, the taste of iron at the back of the throat from fear, the roughness of the fabric against skin, the remembered scent of a mother's perfume, the thunder of a heart that wants to run but cannot. Inside the Vestal's mind, time can elongate into a painful tautness. A child's memory of laughter in a household garden. A secret wish unspoken, the precise recitation of a ritual verse that once comforted her, now repels her. The mind cycles through bargaining, disbelief, and a small hardy insistence on dignity. Standing straight, speaking clearly, keeping the ritual phrases intact to the last. Even the city's response is double-edged. Citizens may feel relief, as if the removal restores civic equilibrium. Yet some experience private unease, an acknowledgement that something sacred has required the ruin of a person. Poets and moralists use these moments to admonish, to warn young women, to lecture magistrates. They turn individual pain into moral exemplum. The civic language of purification masks a profound human cost. And so the story descends to procedure. The pontiffs consult the omens. The Pontifex Maximus presides. Specific prayers are recited that, on paper, aim to restore ritual order. The condemned Vestal is required to perform a few last scripted gestures, perhaps a final recitation, a small libation, gestures that seal the transformation from living human to civic instrument. The city's priests speak in low, measured Latin, phrases that, to the crowd, carry the gravity of law and God. The ritual is deliberate and exact. Every motion is meant to reassure Rome that the sacred flame will not be dimmed. From here, the slow, intimate unraveling begins, what it felt like in the feet and hands as the state turned sanctity into sentence. The carriage of ritual grinds on, drums of sandals on cobbles. A low chant from the priests like a far-off tide, and the condemned's breath misting in the cold Roman morning. The crowd presses at windows and along the forum's edges. Children are hushed by anxious parents who glance toward the temple as if the goddess herself might look back. Every sensory detail lingers: sandals scraping, a lamp's last sputter, the smell of damp stone. And with them comes the creeping realization that what the city calls piety is also a sentence. Inside the procession, hands that once tended sacred embers wrinkle around the edges of a mantle. Fingers remember the texture of flame-warmed bronze and now clutch empty air. The condemned moves with the ritualized composure taught from childhood, phrases recited, steps measured, yet the body betrays small tells, a tremor in the jaw, a shallow breath, palms slick with a foreign sweat. The auditory landscape tightens. A priest's whisper of a formula, a magistrate's bark, the rustle of papyrus as records are checked, the technical choreography of guilt and law. The legal theatre around the Vestal is important to Rome's leaders because the crime is translated into civic terms. The charge of incestum is framed not as private betrayal, but as a wound to the res publica. The Vestal's chastity is described as a safeguard of Rome's fortunes. Pontiffs and magistrates speak of omens and rites, citing precedent and ritual precision, and the trial's language is deliberately liturgical. To the crowd, this makes the outcome seem like a religious necessity rather than the executing of a woman. Evidence in these trials is both concrete and spectral. Witnesses can testify to late-night meetings or illicit letters. Sometimes the proof is as mundane as a borrowed cloak found in a man's room. Yet the city also seeks signs. Irregular hearth smoke interpreted as omen, the failure of sacrificial flames, auguries read to confirm divine displeasure. Ancient historians relay these moments with a mix of legal jargon and moralizing flourish, showing how religion and law braided together to produce verdicts that seemed inevitable. The political calculus is never far. A rival might point a finger to discredit a senator allied with the Vestal's family, or a populist magistrate might seize the scandal to display his piety and muscle. In an age when images and reputations are currency, accusing a Vestal can be a strategic strike. The woman at the center becomes an instrument in factional warfare, her private life mined for public advantage. The city's appetite for symbolic purity feeds political hunger. As the sentence is carried out, the construction of the chamber matters as much as the act. The pit is a small lined space, windowless, weighted with stone and suffused with the chill of the underground. The Romans take pains to describe it as an exile rather than a murder. Provisions placed carefully, a lamp lit, earth mounded as in a funeral rite. Yet these gestures of ritual propriety thin quickly against the human facts: darkness that compresses sound, air that turns stale, the quickening panic when the last light is lowered. Inside that pit, the sensory world collapses into a handful of elements. The lamp throws a narrow circle of gold. Beyond it, absolute dark. The taste of stale bread becomes a focused obsession, the texture of rough cloth magnified against skin. Breath becomes a metronome. Each inhalation is acid and loud in the ears. Emotion rotates through discrete phases, first disbelief, then bargaining, then a stubborn, paradoxical calm as the mind seeks to befriend the inevitable. The Vestal training, the exactness demanded of her in ritual, can surface here as both curse and comfort. She recites verses to steady the panic, uses liturgical structure to hold the self intact. Outside, the city resumes commerce as if nothing profound has happened, but the ritual leaves traces. Families watch from thresholds, eyes red from unshed tears. The accused's household is stripped of visible honors, its name a whisper in the marketplace. The political winners mark time with official statements and recorded omens. Scribes write the act into the city's memory as a precedent, a legal example to be wielded later. The state thus converts personal annihilation into civic pedagogy. The aftermath is also juridical theatre. Because Roman law and religion are intertwined, officials perform a kind of semantic sleight of hand. Since the death occurred via interment rather than direct violence, the state claims it has not shed sacred blood. This legal fiction preserves the purity of temple rites and absolves magistrates of sacrilege. Yet historians of antiquity make room for paradox and pity. They note how the city comforts itself with legality while a life is extinguished beneath its feet. Political manipulation continues after the sentence. The families of accused lovers, often men whose guilt is alleged, are socially damaged. Some face corporal punishments, fines, or exile, depending on their rank and the vigor of the prosecutor. Accusers can find themselves lauded or in turn prosecuted if their claims later appear politically motivated. Thus, the ritual of punishment ripples outward, distorting alliances, reshaping reputations, and feeding a cycle in which religious purity serves partisan ends. But despite the spectacle, not every charge was founded on malice. Sometimes genuine transgression occurred. History records moments when a Vestal's oath was broken, whether by will, coercion, or circumstance. The sources, cautious, judgmental, and often moralizing, try to give texture to these rare events, framing them as catastrophic not only for the woman, but for the state. The rhetoric surrounding such episodes emphasizes the calamity of impiety and the necessity of decisive symbolic punishment to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. For the women themselves, the long-term psychological cost is subtle and totalizing. Even those who serve the full term and step back into private life are often altered. The public role has carved grooves of expectation into their sense of self. Freed Vestals retain unusual legal privileges, rights to property, and an honored place in public ritual, but they also emerge as living reminders of the state's claim on their bodies and histories. Their memories are tangled with civic memory. The city keeps them as exemplar, objects of reverence who, ironically, remain vulnerable to the law that elevated them. It is crucial to see the ritual as a mechanism of control as much as a religious act. A society that sacralizes certain bodies can also normalize extraordinary forms of coercion against them. The Vestals were both powerful and powerless, endowed with privileges that made them exceptional, yet bound by laws that allowed the state to extinguish them. That contradiction is no accident. It is a feature of how Rome balanced religious spectacle with authoritarian governance. And so Act 3's middle sequence is heavy with duplicities. The luxury that masks surveillance, the sanctity that camouflages ownership, the language of piety that renders violence palatable. The city insists on a narrative where the goddess must be defended, while men in togas draft the script and supervise the performance. The Vestal, at the center of the stage, becomes both altar and sacrifice, a human body converted into legal and symbolic capital. As we dwell on these scenes, the sensory detail grows more intimate. The scratch of straw beneath a sleeping mat in the atrium Vestae, recalled alongside the final rasp of breath in a sealed chamber, the glow of public torches during festivals mirrored by the solitary wick in the pit. Contextual fragments, paraphrased phrases from Roman pontiffs, mentions of the crime as incestum, the Pontifex Maximus's role in oversight, circulate like incantations that justify and explain. The ritual machinery clicks into place, beautiful on paper and devastating in effect. This is the moral tension Rome lived with. A city that needed visible rites to bind its people together, but that also used those rites to discipline and sometimes destroy. The narrative here is not simply one of isolated cruelty, it is the story of structural power enacted through sacral language. The Vestal's fate illuminates a broader truth about empire. that reverence for tradition can become a tool for control, that public honor can be swapped for private death. In that sense, this is where personal memory and civic myth collide, where a woman's life, once private, is recorded as an example for all. The story continues toward its final, formalized moments, but before we follow that procession to its end, we must sit with the echo. How does a society that sacrifices its own symbols justify the cost? The question doesn't vanish with the final clod of earth, it echoes. The final walk is short, but amplified by silence. The priests fall into a measured cadence as the cart slows beside the earth. The condemned's breath lands in the chest like a bell. You hear the scrape of shovels and the low murmur of ritual phrases, words that promise restoration while treating a life as a problem to be solved. The last visible light is a wick, guttering, its smell of oil and smoke folding into the damp, mine-like air. The chamber itself is modest and precise, a narrow-lined hypogum where a lamp, a crust, and a little water are given in token. These provisions are part of the Act's theology. Officials insist they avoid spilling blood and so maintain ritual purity. Inside, sensations collapse. The cold closes around limbs, darkness compresses sound, breath becomes a metronome. One can imagine the last human calculations, mouthing ritual phrases, counting breaths, clutching rough cloth until the world narrows to wick and wall. Outside, Rome tells a different story. The pontiffs announce favorable omens, sacrifices are offered, and senators note precedent. Scribes set the event into legal memory under the rubric of protecting the res publica. Later, moralists and antiquarians retell the event as a necessary horror, a stabilizing purgation. The ritual becomes a civic script that reassures, a spectacle that converts fear into order. But fragments of dissent survive. Some ancient voices betray pity, private unease at turning sacred women into instruments of punishment. Livy and other annalists record the legal reasoning, but also let slip moral tremors. Poets and private letters hint at discomfort with converting sanctity into sentence. Those textual traces are themselves evidence that contemporaries felt the strain between reverence and violence. Functionally, the practice served Rome. It provided a visible mechanism for resolving religious panic and showed the state acting decisively against impurity. It also sent a message. Certain bodies are honored and owned. Symbols require policing. The Vestals thus became levers of social control, their exaltation a public asset, their punishment a public demonstration. The line between guardian and prisoner was drawn intentionally. Yet the human cost resists legal language. Families who lost daughters to the temple or the pit carried private grief the rites could never fully absorb. Freed Vestals who returned to private life retained privileges, but also the memory that the state could claim their bodies. Biographical traces show some living quietly, protected by status. Others vanish into the margins of local history, their stories lost to the archives. The revelation is blunt. Sacredness can be a mask for coercion and ritual a tool of governance. When state power cloaks itself in transcendence, it gains legitimacy and a means to discipline. The live burial is not only an odd, ancient punishment, it is a technology of power that solves civic anxiety while erasing a person. So what do we take away? Historically, the Vestals were not merely paragons of virtue, they were central nodes in Rome's web of authority, visible, powerful, and constrained. And the warning is modern. Wherever we elevate symbols above people, we risk turning reverence into coercion. Ritual may look tidy on paper, bright torches, written decrees, official omens, but it registers in the lives it consumes. Honor without autonomy is brittle. Rome's flame burned as a public safeguard, but the hands that tended it were never entirely free. We end with an uncomfortable image, a woman carried through a city that worships her symbol and then tucks her away beneath its soil. It is both a historical fact and a perennial lesson about the cost of preserving symbols at the expense of human dignity.